everyone. This is Sofia Smallstorm doing one of my podcasts. It is July 1st, and I am happy to introduce you to Bruce Campbell, who is a person I've known for a while. I had listened to a radio show he did with another host, and it was the real story of the USS Liberty. And I was fascinated by the way he recounted what seems to be what really happened. I know a lot of people who know a lot about the USS Liberty, but Bruce knows more than anyone so far that I've encountered. But apart from being a historical expert, and he gets a lot of accolades from people who say there's nobody better than Bruce Campbell on history. He has his own websites, he'll tell you about them, but he's also extremely talented in many, many ways, which is really mind-boggling. He designed some kind of off-road vehicle that the military was ready to buy in place of the Hummer, which we have now become familiar with on the roads, and actually they've been retired. Nobody who's cool has a Hummer anymore, but that was the Hummer 2, the commercial Hummer, but the military Hummer, I think it was called the Humvee, was something that Bruce improved on and had the opportunity to land a big contract, and he will tell you more about this, and then we'll get into the USS Liberty. But I'm fascinated by all these things that Bruce can do, and he writes. He's written a screenplay on this story of the USS Liberty, which I will post in my description of this podcast, and you can access it, you can read it. He's a great writer, great storyteller. So here we go. Welcome, Bruce. How are you?
Well, thank you, Sophia. I'm doing pretty well.
Well, you want to tell people about, either you could start with that Humvee story. I think that is fascinating.
Okay, well, maybe before that, I'll share about the, I'm interested in solutions. I've gotten so that I just don't like diagnosis, analysis, listing all the problems we have, and I'm more interested in solutions, recommendations, proposals. How do we get out of this mess? So I've always been kind of oriented towards solving problems. The first one I tried to solve was, as a kid, and growing up in the 50s, I was kind of horrified by the prospect of car crashes. I thought they were just a horrible way to die or get hurt, and so pointless. So I was interested in safety, but not government-imposed safety, but rather individual learning how to be safe. And I raced cars. When I was 18, I went down to Australia and raced cars there in 1965, and then I spent the year 67 racing cars in England, single-seaters, the little Formula cars, and came back and eventually started something called the School of Slide Control. I taught would-be racing drivers, police, regular drivers about controlling slides and car control. So I thought this was the way to deal with the hazard of losing control. So that was my first venture into solving problems. I was unfortunately too far ahead of the power curve in the 1960s. People just still weren't that interested in that in this country. Then I went over to Africa.
Wait. Before we talk about Africa, what was it that you designed? Slider control?
Slide control.
Slide control.
It was called the School of Slide Control. There's an article on my website by Popular Mechanics that they took the course and waxed eloquent about it. I thought it was fantastic.
So you were teaching methods that would prevent you from going out of control, driving methods or something?
Exactly. It was if you lose control of the car, either at the front end or the rear end, the front end plows straight ahead into something, or the rear end whips around and wants to spin you out. I taught people how to avoid those things.
I see. Okay, that makes sense.
Then, after a business trip to Central America, South Africa, and Rhodesia in '71, I returned to Rhodesia and joined up with them and fought in that terror war in the early 1970s in Rhodesia, which is today's Zimbabwe, because we lost.
So you joined the Rhodesians?
Yes, I did. I joined the Rhodesian security forces.
And why was that?
Well, a couple of reasons. I mean, I was humiliated after learning about the situation in Rhodesia that America was causing. America wanted black rule for Rhodesia and demanded it. They didn't want the whites to continue to be in control of that little country about the size of Montana. The little country, though, has the world's only real reserves of chromium ore, which you have to have for stainless steel and all kinds of things. So the American government wanted black communists in control of those resources, not only chrome, but gold and nickel and all kinds of strategic minerals. And it was eventually successful, but I did fight with them for about 2 years and helped, just because it was humiliating for an American such as myself to have my government leading the communist takeover of that little country, which was pretty much patterned itself on America. I mean, it had a Declaration of Independence from England that was patterned on our declaration, and it just wanted to be friends with us, but of course we not interested in being friends with that sort of country. And
now, Bruce, how old were you then when you were joining with the Rhodesian, security forces?
I just turned 26.
Okay, so you were young, idealistic, and that was a very kind, very generous thing for you to do.
Yeah, they were pretty impressed that some kid from California would come all the way down there and join up with them and do what I did. So, hold on one second. Anyway, so that was my first real venture into the political world, power politics. So, came back to the United States eventually and went into the oil business as a drilling foreman for Atlantic Richfield. And I don't know. I did so many. I've done so many things. Started writing screenplays, as you mentioned. Came close to having them produced one by one. The first one, Steve McQueen wanted to do it. Believe it or not, he wanted to play me in what I did in Africa.
So you wrote a screenplay about going to Africa.
Yeah, called The Sharp End. It's on my website. It's quite interesting.
What's it called?
The Sharp End.
The Sharp End. Okay, and how did you learn to write screenplays? It's an art, not just anybody can write a screenplay.
Yeah, I found that out. Found that out with the first one I wrote. It's a difficult thing to do at first. Once you get the hang of it, it's pretty simple. But anyway, I wrote the first one, and even though I was not in the proper form, McQueen liked it a lot. He wanted to make it. He even asked Clint Eastwood to direct him in it. Eastwood
now, how did you get it to Steve McQueen?
Well, a funny story. My parents were in the real estate business in Carmel, and they had a client, Sidney Froman, and Sidney had an attorney named Sherwin Goldstein, who was a theatrical attorney. And Sidney said, "I hear you've written a screenplay." I said, "Yes, I have." He said, "Well, give it to Sherwin." So Sherwin got it, and somehow he just presented it to Steve McQueen, and McQueen loved it. But they didn't tell me. I mean, Sherwin Goldstein didn't tell me this. Sidney did. So Goldstein had me down to Hollywood or to L.A. for a meeting. And
wait a minute, how old were you then? What year was this?
This is 1975.
Okay.
So I was about, I don't know, probably 28, something like that.
Okay. Still very unusual, it's extremely difficult to get noticed by these people, and There are all kinds of creative ways that people try to throw their scripts in front of bigwigs. So you were very lucky.
Well, I was at first until Goldstein brought in a professional screenwriter to put the finishing touches on it, and they had me down there for a meeting and said that they needed to make some changes in the script. I said, well, okay, what do you want to do? Well, we want to make the American a little tougher. Tougher. I said, well, he's pretty tough. You know, I was talking about me.
Right.
Well, we want to make him mean. Mean. Yeah. And we want to make the freedom fighters a little bit more sympathetic. Now, I said, by the freedom fighters, who are you talking about? Well, you know, I said to me, the terrorists, the ones I was fighting? Well, that's your word for them. Okay. You want to make the American meaner, you want to make the terrorists more sympathetic. I said, look, I'm sorry. You know, I'm going to work in the oil field and I don't need this. I got a reputation in Rhodesia and I couldn't have my name on something like what I think you're trying to do. So I walked away from it.
So they were retooling your characters and characterizations more to their preferred formula, which always has a political end, right?
Exactly. It was
socio-political end. Yeah.
They wanted a pro-communist, pro-terrorist, anti-white vehicle. Mm-hmm. And I said, no, I can't do that. And then, amazingly, about a few months later, Goldstein gave it to Clint Eastwood. And so I called, after appropriate time, I called Eastwood's office in Warner Brothers, got his reader named Sonia Chernus. She said, yeah, I've read it. I said, okay. I mean, she said, I've sent a letter to your lawyer. Okay, but you might as well tell me what you said. I'm going to find out. Well, it's not for Mr. Eastwood. Okay, how come? It's too controversial. Oh, now wait a minute. I said, Dirty Harry was probably the most controversial movie ever made. The Supreme Court of the U.S. came out against Dirty Harry. She said, Dirty Harry wasn't fascist. No. I didn't think it was fascist. Of course, I didn't realize what she was saying. The Jewish woman, she was saying that it was threatening it was not good for Jews. In other words, my screenplay was not good.
Directly or indirectly?
Well, once you realize the nature of communism and the nature of Judaism, then you realize that anybody who criticizes communism is considered to be criticizing Judaism. Okay. That's the secret formula of Hollywood. And it's just the way it is. They run the show down there. Right. So, anyway, I didn't learn my lesson. I kept writing screenplays and pretty much for myself. I mean, even Warner Brothers actually had me write one called Militia Rising, because the guy there at Joel Silver Pictures found out that I'm the guy that started the militia movement. So he said, hey, I hear you can write screenplays. I said, sure. Well, write us one about the militia.
And what year was that?
That was 1994.
So before we were in the 70s, and now we're in the 90s, and they're still calling on you. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, they don't call on me anymore.
No, I understand. But for all that time, they were still, knocking on your door. You must have written very good screenplays, Bruce. Very, very good. Because it is an art, and it's not that simple. I mean, I have also coached screenwriting a little bit and written some screenplays myself and worked very hard to get them read. And it is enormously, enormously difficult to get anyone to pay attention to you. And I have gotten pretty close. I got to a really good boutique agency, and they asked me the same thing. They said, this is too original and creative for Hollywood. You are going to have to dumb it down. And everybody told me, why don't you? Because then they'll produce your movie. And I said, I cannot do something that I'm going to have to apologize for later on and explain why the plot was so dumb. when it wasn't done to begin with. So I never made those changes, and I guess I lost my opportunity.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why I'm sorry about the little interruption, but I'm really in awe of how much they must have liked your work. That's great. I mean, obviously, it's great because you can write. That's the part that's great. And not everybody can.
Yeah, I remember my second one I wrote. It was called Conspiracy. I've since changed the names of some of these screenplays. You'll see them, but they're in their chronological order on my website. But I wrote one called Conspiracy, which was about the artificial energy crisis, because I just come out of the oil field after 4 years. So this independent group in Michigan loved the screenplay. They came out to Los Angeles. They had me back down to Los Angeles, put me up at the finest hotel, said that they were going to make this movie. They'd already started another movie with Lee Marvin and Angie Dickinson called Fast Eddie in Detroit, and they had Bank of America wanted a 3-picture package. That was the style back in the 80s. And so they wanted my picture to be the number 2 one. So they took the script over to the Bank of America motion picture division in L.A. Those guys read it. They hated it so much they canceled the Lee Marvin, Angie Dickinson movie, and these people were run out of business because of this screenplay called Conspiracy. I mean, this is what you're up against in Hollywood.
So there was no Lee Marvin, Angie Dickinson movie called Fast Eddie then?
They were so angry that they presented, that these people from Michigan presented this script of mine to them for financing, that they canceled the entire 3-picture program, including the one that already started filming with Lee Marvin and Angie Dickinson and Jonathan Winters in Detroit. So,
wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cold. So, I've had some close calls, but, I'm not, you just can't outfox these guys. You can't fool them. You can't, these Jews who run Hollywood, they cannot be tricked. They're too good at what they do. Here's the situation. You cannot present a hero. The forbidden subject for a movie is a strong, intelligent, courageous, heroic figure, man or woman. Not possible. I mean, you ever notice that?
The hero has to have the qualities that fit their social agenda. I mean, I don't see how you can say that you can't trick them, because they are very astute and aware of all of the possibilities if they were to produce something that was of quality, let's just say generically speaking. So they don't have quality in mind as the overriding goal. They have a social agenda. They are socially engineering the population by producing these films that are increasingly weirder and weirder every decade, right? So it started out with the anti-hero. Yes, exactly. And that was to do the male bashing, especially the white male bashing.
Yeah. I mean, Humphrey Bogart, was the anti-hero. And of course, Paul Newman became the quintessential anti-hero, self-hating guy. So anyway, this is the Hollywood method, is to destroy masculinity and femininity and blending the two and distorting both, and that's just the way Hollywood is. That's their number one method. It's
not just the way, it's been very carefully planned, This is the plan. And people don't realize that. I remember in the 90s and in the 80s, people saying things like, I just don't understand why the movies are this way, or why they have all this violence and all this sex and blood, and you go to a movie and you're just basically drenched in blood.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult to watch. I remember I don't even go to movies anymore in the theater, and I do not want to break my streak, and I'm not going to break my streak. But I used to have to go to movies and literally cringe and close my eyes and cover my face and ears so that I didn't see this stuff, because it was too much to look at.
And politically, you notice that never in any movie is a person, male or female, it's a good person, the leading person in the movie, allowed to carry a gun. You got to be a cop, a criminal, or a spy, or a soldier. to carry a gun in a movie. But regular people are not allowed to have guns to protect themselves.
That's very interesting. Really right. Yeah.
That's just one, typical aspect of what we're up against. And, I grew up in the 50s, and my whole life was pretty much patterned, for better or for worse, on the Davy Crockett thing from 1954-55. That set my pattern. Then I found out that I had a relative who died at the Alamo, so, oh my God, I was hooked. And that was my role model. But we don't have that anymore. The kids today don't have any role models. They're not allowed to. Hollywood knows that they mustn't be given any positive role models.
Yeah.
And my screenplays all have this type of character, male or female, who's admirable and does the right thing under any and all circumstances. But that's verboten in Hollywood.
Yeah. No, well, I'm very glad you had so many close calls, and in some ways, Bruce, I'm very glad you didn't have a movie produced, because ultimately it would have been taken completely out of your hands and altered in some dreadful ways, and you would have had to apologize, and anyway,
Exactly.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about your all-terrain invention.
Well, I got blown up by a Soviet anti-tank mine in Rhodesia. I was in a Land Rover of all things. Lucky to survive that. And it was a pretty common problem for us down there. So they had come up with some pretty innovative countermeasures. And when I came back to this country after getting out of the oil field, somebody hired me in a bulletproof car company in Monterey, and I was the head of that for a while. And I presented an idea to put this General Electric LexGuard, it's a clear polycarbonate material, in a military vehicle, and the FMC turned me down. So I called the Pentagon, talked to the head of research, and he said, don't try to modify an existing vehicle. You want to build something, build it from the ground up. And he gave me all these pointers. So I thought back in my experience in Africa with the landmines and what we did. So I created this vehicle called the Flea, Forward Light Escort Armored. And it was very innovative. It had fiberglass armor. It had the wheels way outboard so that if you hit a landmine, that it wouldn't be underneath the vehicle. It would blow the one corner off. And it got more and more sophisticated. So I submitted it at the time, about 1982, to Tank Automotive Command. Now, this is very naive. I probably shouldn't have even done this, but I did. I submitted it for their new program called the High Mobility Multi-Purpose Wheeled Vehicle, which we know is the Humvee, what became the Humvee. So a few months after I sent it to TACOM, Tank Automotive Command in Warren, Michigan, I called them and I said, how's it going? How's the selection process going? They said, okay. What's yours? I said, mine's called the Flea. Oh yeah, the Flea. I got it here somewhere. So he looked around and said, yeah, here. Oh, he said, this is armored. Yeah, I said, it's armored, but it's within the weight parameters that you're asking for. Yeah, he said, but, we don't want armor. I said, I know. You want something that stops the equivalent of a pellet coming out of a pellet rifle. Yeah, he said, we call it psychological armor. Psychological armor. I said, you mean the guys just think they're sitting behind armor? Yeah, I said, pretty much. I said, well, geez. I said, why not give them the protection? Well, we don't want that. And so they finally chose what became the Humvee, the preposterous four-wheel, modern-looking Jeep thing. It's about 8 feet wide. It's unbelievably, incredibly preposterous. And it has no protection, which I guess the Army thought they were never going to get shot at ever again, in 1982. Well, they sent thousands of these things to Iraq, and thousands of guys got blown up in them and just killed and maimed and head injuries like you can't believe. I mean, the thing was just a nightmare.
But wait, I have to interrupt. I can't believe that they would think they would never get shot at. It makes more sense that they would want a vehicle that gave people the false impression of being a strong, protective, carrier. And then that wasn't the case. So they get all these injuries. They get all this physical and mental trauma. I don't understand why any other reason for this. I mean, how could they know they're going to get attacked? Somebody, if you're in a war, that's what happens.
Well, in 1982, of course, we hadn't gone against Panama yet, or was that little island, Grenada. Certainly hadn't gone against Iraq and Desert Storm yet. That came 1989 or 1991. But Panama was 89, and then Grenada, and then Desert Storm. By that time, as a friend of mine who was in World War II said, they didn't give a shit about us. That was his salty ideas about what the American government thought about the American GI, or he was a pilot. He said they just didn't care, and nothing's changed. Now, I think the fabled death toll of Americans in Iraq is something like 4,100, 4,200, I don't know, 4,700, whatever it is. But the Department of Veterans Affairs put out a figure of 75,000 dead Americans in Iraq. So I don't know where the truth is, but it's somewhere in between there, apparently. They didn't care. Israel made it happen, made the war happen. They didn't care about Americans getting killed. Israel, or Jews in general, look at the American man as the fascistic element of society, and cares only about having the American man, the American male, in the military, where he can be totally controlled by the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Once he becomes a veteran, once he's out of the military, he becomes a liability. He becomes a potential terrorist, as we see now. Mm-hmm. So, to answer your question about why would they subject these guys to these preposterous, unprotected vehicles in the shooting war, well, I guess they just wanted them wiped out.
I think they want them injured. That's what it is. They don't want injuries prevented. They want injuries because there's that much more damage to the population, and it's all about damaging the psyche, damaging the individuals, damaging the groups, the families, the collectives, so that you can keep breaking everything down, breaking all the bonds down and breaking the strength down. So it's very sad, and all these guys who sign up for military participation, especially now there are so many people of other ethnicities and cultures that want to do this as a way to get an education, a start in life, serve the country they're in, that they've moved to and have heard all about and finally living in. It's very, very sad and ultimately confusing, but it does serve a purpose, and we are the brawn of the world, fighting and destroying, and obviously it's not necessarily an American idea. I understand what you mean. There are foreign interests that control this country. So and that is where we get into the subject of USS Liberty. I really, really want to hear the details of that story, as once many years ago in an interview you did.
Yeah, it was preceded in 1954. See, the Liberty attack was during the Six-Day War of 1967, but it was preceded in 1954 by what they call the Lavon Affair, and Israel arranged for terrorist events in Cairo and other Egyptian towns and cities committed by Israel, but to be blamed on Egyptians against America and England. England was still in charge of the Suez Canal, and they were going to pull out of there and turn it over to the Egyptians. Well, the Israelis didn't want that, so they wanted to make trouble by attacking American and British institutions such as libraries and movie houses and schools with bombs. The Israelis are the ultimate bombers. They are the terrorists par excellence. They created the idea of terror. They founded a country.
They announced that themselves. They created international terrorism with the Irgun and the Stern Gang, right?
Right, and the so-called nation of Israel was founded because of terrorist acts against England and against the Palestinians. So the first false flag event was this Lavon affair. Nobody got killed in it, but some bombs blew up and did some damage, and as luck would have it, the inept Israeli terrorists were captured by the Egyptians and punished. And so it was a very embarrassing revelation that our so-called ally would be attacking us, but pretending to be Egyptians. Okay, that was 1954. Okay, so 13 years later, the Israelis were planning to attack all the Arab countries surrounding them in June of 1967, and they did. At the same time, this old freighter called the SS Simmons Victory had been rebuilt by the NSA and called the USS Liberty. And it was, it had like $40 million worth of equipment put on it, like 50 or so radio antennas, and it even had one massive dish antenna that would bounce a 10,000 watt signal off the moon down to the NSA headquarters at Cheltenham, Maryland. I mean, this was the ultimate in spycraft.
Right, so it was a reconnaissance spy.
Yeah, it was a spy ship.
Yeah.
And it was not run by the Navy, even though it was supposedly a Navy ship, and it had Navy captain and a lot of Navy hands on it, but it was really run by the NSA. And it was sent from its usual patrol off of West Africa. All of a sudden, it was sent up to Gibraltar and then across the Mediterranean to Gaza and the Sinai, right in the middle of this 6-day war. And it got there on the, fourth day of the 6-day war. Now, people might think that's a coincidence. Well, they might also think it's a coincidence that Jack Ruby was in the basement when Lee Oswald was brought out. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a coincidence. He was sent there to shoot Oswald, just as the Liberty was sent to Gaza to be sunk. That was the whole purpose, in my opinion, looking at it.
The Liberty was going to be sunk itself.
Yeah, that was the whole, to me, this was the centerpiece of the 6-day war, was the sinking of the Liberty, and then that sinking to be blamed on Egypt. Just like the Lavon affair, the whole
right. But whose idea was it? It was the NSA's idea to do that?
No, not as far as I know. I think it was the idea of Lyndon Johnson and the two people who controlled him, Matilda Krim and her husband Arthur Krim. Mm-hmm. Arthur Krim was the head of United Artists. He was a Democrat Party fundraiser, of course, an ardent Zionist Jew. His wife Matilda was having an affair
with Johnson.
She was not Jewish, but she'd married a Jewish terrorist named Denon and divorced him and married Krim. And she worked for the Irgun, as you mentioned. She was a courier and a spy for the Irgun in the 50s and 60s. So they manipulated Johnson, persuaded him that this was a great idea to sink the Liberty and blame it on Egypt. Now, this is I'm not making this up. This was an actual operation called Operation Cyanide. That's the name of this thing.
Yeah, that's your screenplay, right?
And my screenplay is called Cyanide, but it's based on a book by a BBC man named Peter Hownan.
How do you spell that?
Hounan, Peter Hounan, with a BBC, wrote Operation Cyanide, and he describes this diabolical plot to send the Liberty into the war with naval ship was 500 miles away up in the Aegean or someplace on maneuvers. There was a submarine.
Okay, the Skype glitched. So to send this operation into the Mediterranean?
The Operation Cyanide was to send the Liberty into the war zone off Gaza, off of Sinai.
Right.
And be sunk and blamed on Egypt. That was the whole deal. And then, as a result, Operation Cyanide also included the nuking of Cairo and Alexandria by fighter bombers off the USS America and Saratoga, who were up in the Aegean on maneuvers. But the plan was to nuke Cairo, and then America would enter the war and occupy the Arab countries, eventually giving them over to Israel.
So when you say nuke, you mean a nuclear attack on?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Cairo was scheduled to be nuked.
Mm-hmm. And so the Liberty had a role, a strategic role. It was going to be the Tonkin thing.
Exactly. Those 300 guys were to be killed and sunk and disappeared, and then the whole thing blamed on Egypt.
Now, was the Liberty, I guess, for lack of a better word, staffed with regular sailors, or were they NSA people, or what? Who were they? Do you know?
Well, the guys who ran the ship were Navy. They were regular Navy guys.
And they didn't know that this was going to be their fate, right?
They didn't. There's evidence now that the captain, McGonigal, knew that they were going to be hit. He didn't. I don't think he knew that they were going to be sunk.
Spell his name, please.
McGonagle. McGonigal.
McGonigal. Okay.
There's evidence that he knew there was going to be an incident.
Involving his ship.
Yes, but I'm certain that he didn't know it was going to be so drastic and that they were going to be sunk. Okay.
Carry on.
Because his behavior was very strange before and then after the attack. And I'll get into that.
All right.
Anyway, the ship got to the area 12 miles or so off Gaza and Sinai and began its pattern of going up and down the coast in a dogleg pattern to listen in on, it turned out to be listening on the Israeli radio transmissions. And it didn't get to do that for very long. It got there in the dark hours, and then by morning it started its dogleg pattern along Sinai and started being overflown by Israeli airplanes, flying Boxcar and some others, and they overflew them for a couple of hours, and things kind of calmed down, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this unbelievable attack occurred, and they were hit by rockets, by machine guns, by cannon, and on the first pass, these unmarked French fighters, they were Mirage fighters with no markings on them, they took out all of the radio dishes and antennas because they all gave off signals, and the rockets were attracted to the dishes and the antennas by their own signals, and they were destroyed in the first pass, all 50 of them, including the great big one on the stern that bounced the signal off the moon back to NSA headquarters.
So the French were in on this too?
No. they were French fighters that the Israelis had obtained.
Oh, they're being flown by Israelis.
By Israelis.
Okay. And now these details are documented from by the survivors?
Yes, they were first documented by James Ennis in a book called The Attack on the Liberty, which came out around, I think, 1980. Because for all those 13 years before the book came out, they were under strict orders not to say a word, or they would be sent to prison for life, or worse. But I'll get into that in a minute.
Okay.
So, not only did they get hit by rockets and machine guns and cannon fire from the Mirages, they got hit by napalm by these Mystère fighters. They dropped napalm on the ship. This jellied gasoline. It was dreadful. And that didn't have the desired effect. It did a lot of damage. It killed, 9 or 10 people and wounded a whole bunch. But then 3 motor torpedo boats came out from Ashdod on the Israeli coast. And each one of them had 2 torpedoes. And they lined up and they fired all 6 torpedoes. Some say 5, but probably 6 torpedoes at the Liberty. And 5 of them missed. One of them did hit. And it hit right where the NSA guys were doing their work down below, and it killed 25 of them. It blew a 40-foot hole in the hull. Unbelievable damage. Should have sunk the ship immediately. But it gets into the miraculous in this story, because the thing didn't sink. It listed over to 13 degrees or something, and finally settled out about 9 degrees list. And it was in definite danger of sinking at any time, but it didn't. And nobody can really explain how this old freighter could survive such a drastic attack from the air and from the sea. But it did.
Against all odds.
Totally. So, long story short, it was ordered, McGonigal was ordered by Washington to make his way to the island of Malta, which was like 6 days away. And for the first 17 hours, the Liberty got no support from any American ship. It was left on its own. It lost its steering. It lost a lot of its power. The guys were down below with great, huge plumber's wrenches, massive wrenches. That's how they were steering the thing. They'd put the wrenches on the control to the tiller. And, it's unbelievable. And it made its painful way towards Malta.
And why was it going to Malta? Just because it had been told, or was there a reason for that?
Well, they knew it would take a hell of a long time to get there, if it could even make it, and there was a good chance it would sink en route, because it was in definite danger of sinking. The bulkheads were totally damaged, and the interior walls were holding it together. The outer walls, the hull was destroyed. And
what about food, supplies? There were wounded people, right? Dead people?
Oh, yeah. There were 34 dead, 171 grievously injured. It was a total catastrophe.
So these people Malta is the other direction, so they were sailing off, right? And these people had to somehow take care of each other.
Exactly. And the doctor, the physician, Kiefer, he was grievously wounded. He had a life preserver strapped around his midsection to hold his guts in. Wow. That's how badly hurt he was. And guys were dying because they had no way to save these guys.
Right.
They were bleeding to death, and it was just you can't even describe the sheer horror inflicted by the Israelis and by the Americans. It was a joint U.S.-Israel plot to take over the Middle East, and it failed. So Johnson was beside himself with anger. At one point, towards the end of the attack, actually when it was over, the skippers on the America and the Saratoga, the aircraft carriers, 500 miles away, they weren't in on this thing. They knew. The one on the America knew about Operation Cyanide because he sent the F-4s, the fighter bombers carrying nuclear bombs. He sent them towards Cairo and Alexandria. But the whole thing depended on radio silence, and that's why all those antennas were destroyed on the first pass by the Mirage jets. But one of the miracles that happened that day was that there was an antenna that was out of use, and when all the others had been destroyed, the radio guys said, "Hey, that antenna there, if we could run a coax cable to that one, we might be able to make that one work because it's out of service." And they did. In the midst of all this carnage and crap coming down on them from above, they ran a coax out there at a great risk to their lives, and they got this SOS off to the fleet up in the Aegean or wherever it was, and said, "SOS, SOS, we're under attack." And eventually said, "Well, by whom? We don't know. We have no idea. Maybe Russians, maybe Egyptians." They never dreamed it was Israelis. But, and once this happened, though, the Operation Cyanide had to be called off because it depended on radio silence. That ship had to sink without a word. But if there was a word, then the whole thing was off. And the skippers on the two aircraft carriers, they didn't realize, especially the guy in the Saratoga, didn't know what Operation Cyanide was exactly. So he sent fighters down to help the Liberty. Well, McNamara was the Secretary of Defense, and he was ordered to tell them to bring those blankety-blank planes back, and they did. And then the guy on the America said, "Well, for God's sake," so he got some planes loaded with the right kinds of weapons, sent them off towards the Liberty. Lyndon Johnson called him up and said, "Bring those blankety-blank airplanes back right now." He said, "Oh, it's okay. I've told them only for defensive purposes." He said, "Bring them back now. Don't argue with me. I will not embarrass my allies." Well, nobody knew at that point who was attacking the Liberty except Lyndon Johnson. And that's why he didn't want his Israeli allies embarrassed. So he brought the planes back. He said, "I'd rather they sink the goddamn thing than embarrass my friends." Those were his exact words. So that's why,
And this is in the book by Ennis?
No, it's in the book by Peter Houghton.
Houghton, okay.
Houghton, or I think it's Houghton, Hounam. Peter Houghton, Operation Cyanide.
And that, all right, just clarifying for myself.
So while this crippled freighter, converted spy ship, was on its way to Malta, Admiral Isaac Kidd was brought over on one of those perilous things, cables, between the ships as they go along through the sea with a chair. He and his staff were brought over to the Liberty, and they held a court of inquiry. So he asked the captain, McGonigal, "Are we sound? Are we seaworthy?" He says, "So far." "Okay," he said, "I'm going to hold a court of inquiry en route to Malta. I want to talk to the people who witnessed this thing." So 4 by 4, the men were brought in to be questioned by the admiral, and his little gimmick was he took off his stars, his admiral's stars, off his collar, put them on the table, and said, "Okay, I'm not the admiral now, I'm just one of you guys. I want you to tell me in your own words what happened, what you saw." So they told these horrible stories about the attack and the motor torpedo boats with Israeli flags on them, machine gunning the life rafts that were ordered to be put over the side because the order to abandon ship was actually given. when the listing was so severe, they thought it was going over. So they ordered abandoned ship. So the guys released the big lifeboats on the stern, put them over the side, and the motor torpedo boats from Israel machine gunned these things and destroyed them. This is a war crime. I mean, the whole thing is a war crime, but this is another war crime. So they couldn't abandon ship. They had nothing to get into. Mm-hmm. So he told that story to Isaac Kidd. He said, "Are you sure about that?" "Yes, sir." Mm-hmm. So eventually he put his stars back on his collar and said, "Okay, I'm the admiral again. Now let me tell you something. You're not going to repeat a single word of this to anyone, including among yourselves. You're definitely not going to tell your families. You're definitely not going to tell any reporters. And if you do, you'll go to the brig for life or worse." So they all got the message that they'd be killed, potentially, if they talked about this. And they believed it. They were terrified. They'd been through a terrifying experience, and now they were going through an even more terrifying experience at the hands of their own leadership. They eventually got to Malta, and they were dispersed around the world. They were sent to different postings. Some were sent to hospitals and mental hospitals. Some were subjected to brainwashing, which I go into in my screenplay, Cyanide. Mm-hmm. So it was a horrific experience, and it never ended for them. And 13 years later or so, Ennis finally got the guts to tell the story in his book, Attack on the Liberty. But he was the only one. Nobody else would talk about it because everybody else was so damn scared that they wouldn't say a word.
Ennis was a survivor?
Yeah, he got severely wounded during the attack. It's a miracle he lived. He was the officer of the day
Wasn't
when it
Phil
happened.
Turney also?
Phil Turney was a ship fitter, I think his title was. He spoke to Admiral Kidd. He told him what happened about the lifeboats. But the men didn't say anything. They felt they were under orders to be quiet, and they were terrified of the consequences because they'd lived through such a treacherous attack by their so-called ally that they didn't know what to think or do. They couldn't talk about it. They were terrified. But, recently they've gotten the nerve up, 47 years later, to talk about it. A lot of them still have trouble accusing their own government. I mean, they first started saying, "Hey, my God, that wasn't an accident. That was deliberate, wasn't it? I mean, Israel did that to us on purpose." Mm-hmm. But they couldn't quite bring themselves to accuse their own U.S. government and U.S. Navy of participating in this attempt to kill them all.
Right, and that's the angle of it that you don't really hear, because everybody says, "Oh, Israel conspired to do this and tried to sink this ship of U.S. sailors," but there was much more than that going on.
Yeah, Operation Cyanide is an American military designation. Mm-hmm. It was a joint operation between America and Israel, just like 9/11. Now, what was 9/11? 9/11 was the USS Liberty times 10. But it was a joint operation between the U.S. government and Israel. Same thing. But it got the desired result. It got the American military into the Middle East and killing Muslims. That was the whole purpose of the Liberty assassination attempt. Just didn't happen. It just failed. It was a total catastrophe for the Zionists, whether they're American or Jewish. Israeli.
Yeah, I guess they repeat these things, and in another age it can work if it's tried again and planned out, and there's much more, social blindness and deafness. Back in the 60s, I don't know what the social environment was, and I don't know, of course, much of this, I'm sure this didn't get out to anyone because everybody was separated and ordered not to talk, and it happened to such a few number, well, that's not good English, but to a relatively few people, not...
yeah, exactly.
And it was away from here, at sea, So, but when you mentioned the 1954 incident, I don't know if that made it to the American public at all, did it?
Not at all. No, not at all. Nobody ever heard of it. Nobody's heard of it till relatively recently.
Yeah. Wow. And now we have a culture that doesn't even really care. They're so mesmerized by entertainments. And there we get back into Hollywood and television and shopping and stores. And now, of course, the wireless culture, their iPhones and all their little games and videos. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's all done by entertainment, I think. It's how we're controlled.
Yeah, once, Bruce, I wanted to tell this story in this interview. I was driving. I was in La Jolla at a red light. I was coming up to a red light, and there was a little truck in the lane next to me, and it was such a rattletrap little truck, pickup truck, and it had a bumper sticker on the back that said USS Liberty Survivor. And it was a very old bumper sticker and an old truck, and I got really excited, and I tried as hard as I could to draw parallel with it, and I finally got up to the guy's driver's window, and I put my thumb up, and I waved to the person, and he just looked at me. He was completely baffled. It was a Mexican guy, not very old, and he didn't understand what I was waving and cheering about to him. So I realized, he had bought the truck off somebody, but very possibly that truck could have belonged to a USS Liberty Survivor, right?
Sure, there were white guys on board, there were blacks, and there were Mexicans.
Right, but this guy was not. I don't believe that he was from the USS Liberty. He was too young, and he had no knowledge of what I was waving about. And if he had been, or his father had been, or someone. So I'm thinking this truck was simply acquired, but it still had the bumper sticker on it.
Yeah, it's one of the most suppressed stories in U.S. history, I think.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. And it's that, I've urged so many people to go dig up the interview that you did before that I heard. People who are very big on the USS Liberty. I think it was in June, wasn't it?
Yes, June 8th.
1967. 67, right. In the 6-Day War time period. But this angle of it, nobody seems to know. So that's why I wanted you to inform me again on my own podcast so that now, I have it to direct people to.
Well, there was a very ironic twist to it. Now, a Russian friend of mine, had persuaded me to write this screenplay. I'd pretty much given up, but as a favor to him, I wrote this screenplay because he said, and Bruce, do you think it's possible to find some positive contribution by the Russians in this story? Well, I said, I don't know. I mean, maybe. And I looked into it. Oh my gosh. The Russians, turned out, saved the day. They prevented World War III from happening. Now, that Liberty was trailed from Gibraltar across the Mediterranean by a Russian destroyer. And at some point, the Russian destroyer had to pull back because Liberty got too close to the beach. Way too close. In fact, the Joint Chiefs didn't want the Liberty sent in there. They were not in on this thing.
So this is before the attack?
Yes, before the attack.
Mm-hmm.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff had ordered the Liberty to stay at least 200 miles away from Sinai or Israel. They didn't want this extremely expensive and complicated and super sophisticated spy ship to be put in there by itself with no protection. That was insanity. But the Liberty never got the message. The orders were routed all over the world, wound up in, Somalia or Greece, and they just went all over the place, but the Liberty never got the messages. The chief culprit in the Navy who was responsible for the Liberty not getting the word was John McCain's father, Admiral McCain, who was in charge of the Mediterranean theater. And he was in charge of the cover-up also. He was controlled by Arthur Goldberg, turns out. So the Liberty was betrayed, and it was never supposed to be exposed to this danger. But another aspect of it was a submarine, a U.S. submarine was tailing it. And this was called the USS Amberjack. And it apparently filmed the entire attack through its periscope. It was not very far away. And then, after the attack, it followed the Liberty towards Malta. But the Russian destroyer, the captain of the destroyer, realized the implication of this attack on the Liberty. Because, as I've got it in my screenplay, they can't figure out why is the Liberty being sent into this area by itself. They couldn't understand that. They knew what it was. But all of a sudden they realized what the assignment was, what its role was in this war. It was to be sunk and possibly blamed on Russia. That's how they saw it. So they intervened. They had permission. They intervened once the attack was over. They went up to the Liberty and offered it assistance. Of course, these guys on Liberty knew it was a Russian or a Soviet destroyer, and they said, no, get out of here, get the hell out of here. Not realizing that they'd been attacked by their allies. Now they were being rescued by their enemies. It was extremely ironic. And the destroyer, the Soviet destroyer, stayed with the Liberty as it made its way towards Malta until it met up 17 hours later with the elements of the fleet, the U.S. Navy fleet, which finally came down and got close to it and escorted it towards Malta.
Now that Soviet destroyer, they couldn't offer medical help or anything?
They did offer help.
Okay.
But McGonigal, told them to go to hell.
Oh.
And then McGonigal, I imagine there was some confusion. Who the hell did this? They didn't realize until those motor torpedo boats came out from the beach and attacked them with torpedoes that they didn't realize that it was an Israeli attack.
Yeah, so he must have been very confused because he only knew a little bit of it, and he probably ended up not knowing what was going on.
And he kind of lost his mind. He was from loss of blood. His leg was hit pretty hard by shrapnel, and he did lose a lot of blood. And then he gave a totally erroneous report about the nature of the attack, saying it only lasted a few minutes and everything's okay. Well, hell, but the crew over the years learned to hate McGonigal because they realized that he was in on it. He got the Congressional Medal of Honor himself at a secret ceremony at the Navy Yard. Instead of being presented by the president, he got this Congressional Medal of Honor. And they were pretty resentful about the whole thing because something was fishy about his behavior, especially after when he tended to.
Now, what about the submarine with the footage that they?
Yeah.
Where's that? Does that exist today?
It exists. Ennis has made reference to it. He was told, and other sailors have been told by crewmen from the submarine that they took film of the attack. And of course, then the guys disappeared, and there's been a big mystery. But it's pretty obvious that the whole thing was filmed, and that the mission of the submarine was quite possibly to sink the Liberty if the attack failed, which it did do.
But the submarine did not sink the Liberty.
Thanks to the Russians. That was the thing about the Soviet destroyer. It got in between the Liberty and the submarine that was following it, and they finally just decided to forget it. This is getting too complicated.
So who was in charge of that submarine? Do we know any names?
No, I've investigated it. I've had my Russian friend trying to find out. It's classified information. I name him in my screenplay, but I gave him a
made-up name.
Made-up name.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have to read your screenplay. I mean, I know that from the way you tell stories, your screenplay. I did start to read it, Bruce, and the best way for me to read scripts is to have them printed out.
Yeah.
And so it's not easy to read them online because they end up being actual page turners, and they're very quick, those pages, turning them because there's so much white space on a screenplay in the format. So I wanted to ask you, though, this Sinai is S-I-N-A-I, and then cyanide, sometimes when you say it fast it sounds like cyanide, but cyanide was the name of the mission, right?
Yeah, as in the poison.
Yes. And do you know any reason why they called it cyanide? Because they have odd names for these things, but sometimes they actually make sense.
It's kind of like the naming the roundup of the Russians after World War II, Operation Keelhaul. I mean, it was a sardonic, cynical name for a very treacherous operation, and I suspect the same thing goes for Operation Cyanide.
Because it's so close to Sinai that it's even confusing. You think that it's Operation Sinai, but it's not. It's cyanide.
Cyanide is in the poison.
Yeah.
And that was a poisonous operation, for sure. It was the most treacherous thing. I mean, it was kind of like the grandmother of all false flag operations. Now, what's the source of it? Well, the source of it was, of course, as I mentioned, the Lavon affair, but that was 1954. By 1962, a Jewish general named Lyman Lemnitzer was the head of, he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs under Jack Kennedy. And he presented President Kennedy with something called Operation North Woods, as we all know, which was the false flag Bible. It was first presented as a way to get us to war with Cuba by staging terrorist attacks in Miami and even Washington, D.C. and New York by elements of the U.S. military pretending to be Cuban terrorists and killing Americans, and then even shooting down an American jetliner or airliner and blaming it on Fidel Castro. This was Operation North Woods. And John F. Kennedy was horrified by the concept. He said, hell no, you're not going to do that. You're not going to be doing that kind of thing. But they did. And that's what Operation Cyanide was part of Operation North Woods. It was really the first, maybe not the first. The first one was the Gulf of Tonkin faked attack. And there wasn't any attack, so it wasn't actually a terrorist attack. It was just pretending that the Maddox, the destroyer Maddox, and the other one, I can't remember the name of it, were attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Never happened, but that was the first operation that we know of under Operation North Woods, and then Operation Cyanide, the attack on the Liberty, was the second that I know about.
So you're saying that Northwoods was like the theme book for all of this that was to come.
Yep.
These false flags, staged events with very carefully planned out consequences, and of course the what unrolls into the public consciousness
of 9/11.
Yeah.
But it's all the same thing.
9/11, yeah. It's almost like this is all Rand Corporation stuff as well, you know?
Yeah.
They're manipulating the public mind by way of these events that nobody is there to really see. Nobody's in the Gulf of Tonkin, except for, again, very few numbers of people actually witness this. 9/11 was different because we were in New York and there were lots of people who were nearby, but again, everyone seems very confused about what really happened. Planes, no planes, etc. But by now, we have a media that is far more adept, as I mentioned in my Sandy Hook presentation, at fictionalizing, and the video and the images are so much more easily altered now. And the public's so much less interested in details and willing to accept the sound bites and the general ideas, and then they react to those, if they react at all.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm going to post a PDF or link to your screenplay in the description, and this is a podcast that is available on my website, aboutthesky.com/podcast. So I really have appreciated your time in telling us the story as you have, because I think this is the full story, or as full a story as we can get right now.
Well, anytime, Sophia. I appreciate your all your efforts, especially that Sandy Hook video. That's priceless.
Huh. Well, thank you. I did my best. And so you have a website. You want to tell people what it is?
Well, there's the screenplays and so forth, and a lot of essays are on the older one, J.B. Campbell, extremismonline.com. But since then, everything I've written has gone on to the AmericanDefenseParty.com.
Okay, well, those are the places to find more of what Bruce is about, and definitely, we've got to read your screenplays. I wish we could do just, the way they had in the old days radio plays, and you would just read them aloud, and everybody would sit there enthralled around their radios, and you'd have a few sound effects. But this is another way to produce stories at very low cost, so maybe we should think about it.
It's a good idea.
And you can play many characters, since you seem to have it down.
Sure.
Except the women.
You're right. Thank you for that.
All right. Well, Bruce, thank you so much. I really appreciate this very kind contribution that you made today, so that we all understand the Liberty story much better.
All right, Sophia.
I will probably do this again with you sometime. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.